In the last several chapters, the last several videos, we've been discussing how firms make decisions depending on the different market structure in which they're operating. And so we started with competitive markets, which are kind of our benchmark for efficiency. These are the most efficient markets. And then we went to the other extreme. We talked about monopoly markets, where there's only one seller in the whole market. Then we've talked about monopolistic competition, which is somewhere between competitive and monopoly, maybe a little closer to the competitive side because there still are a lot of sellers, and so there's competition in that sense, and because there's easy entry and exit from these markets. And so the long run consequence of that is that these firms end up with zero economic profits in the long run, which is very similar to what happens in the competitive markets. And now we look at a fourth type of market structure, oligopoly. So an oligopoly is a market in which there are just a few sellers, not a bunch of sellers like the competitive or monopolistic competition markets, but not just one seller like the monopoly. There are a few sellers. They're selling a differentiated product most of the time. It could be similar product. It doesn't really make much difference as far as how we analyze these markets. And in these markets, as you may be able to guess, there are some barriers to entry. Why I say you could probably guess that is that there are a few sellers. If there were not barriers to entry in these markets, then there would be lots of sellers, right? So competition would come into the market if they could. And so similar to what happens in a monopoly market, there must be some sort of barriers that keep people from entering freely or easily into these markets to sustain a market structure in which there are just a few sellers. So how do we know whether a market that we're looking at is an oligopoly or is more competitive or monopolistically competitive? So a monopoly is easy to recognize. There's just one seller, right? And but to tell the difference between what constitutes a few sellers versus many sellers, we use a trick, a feature called the concentration ratio. So the concentration ratio is the sales of the largest four, sometimes it's other numbers, it does not always four, but for these purposes we'll say four. Sales of the largest four firms as a percentage of total industry sales. And so this concentration ratio can give us a measure of oligopoly power in an industry. In other words, how much power do the top four firms have in an industry? And if that number is relatively large, then we say that this is a market that's really controlled by just a few firms. So some examples of oligopoly markets that we may encounter every day in the U.S. Are here. So search engines, Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft, which is Bing, control 98.5% of that market. Right? There are some other tiny search engines that you may have heard of out there, but they have almost no concentration in this market, particularly compared to the three top search engines. Wireless telecommunications, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, and Sprint. Those four hold 94.7% of the sales in the wireless telecom market. Satellite TV, just two of them, DirecTV and Dish Network, have 94.5% of that market. Soda, Coke, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper Snapple have over 90%. Here's one you may not know of or may not think about very often, but if you go into a restroom and you look at the brand that's on, say, the paper towel dispenser in the restroom, you'll notice that it's generally one of three brands. It's Kimberly-Clark, Procter & Gamble, or Georgia-Pacific. So sanitary paper products, those three top players have 92.7% of that market. And you can go on down from there. So these are some markets that we know of that have pretty high concentration ratios, and so they can be analyzed in the light of an oligopoly market. So the concentration ratio is a measure of oligopoly power in the sense that higher concentration means there's greater market power, right? So if just a few firms have a really high percent of the sales in the market, then those few firms have a lot of market power, a lot of power to change what's going on as far as the prices and quantities available in the market. But just a warning, this is just a rough measure of market power. It's not always a perfect measure of market power. So what happens in an oligopoly? If there are just a few firms selling the competing products, right, selling in a particular market, then it would be a lot easier than it would be, say, in a perfectly competitive market where there are tons of firms. In this case, if there are 3 or 4 firms that really control a particular market, it'd be easy and tempting for those firms to get together, right? For the president of Coke to get together with the presidents of Pepsi and Dr. Pepper Snapple and to make some decisions together in order to really control their market. They would like to, in other words, collude or join what's called a cartel to jointly act as a monopoly. So remember, perfectly competitive firms or more competitive firms don't make profit in the long run. A monopoly can make profit in the long run. And so if you guys can get together and set your prices and quantities to look like what a monopolist would do, then you can generate profit in the market and sort of split the winnings, right? This is illegal in the U.S. We're not allowed to collude in the U.S. Firms are not allowed to collude in the U.S. But even where firms do collude or are allowed to collude, that collusion tends to be unstable. And you can probably think about why. If you're working together with others to set a particular price and split the profits, right, there's gonna be an incentive, and we'll get into this further in the next few videos. There's going to be an incentive for somebody to cheat on the rest of the folks, right? Everybody's kind of sticking to the plan. Maybe if you deviate from the plan, you can bring a little more of that profit to yourself, right? And so collusion tends to be unstable because while it's in your best interest to work with everybody else, you don't own each other, right? You still are competitors, and so you still would prefer to make more money than the other guys, and so there might be some incentive for you to do something to deviate from the plan. So an example of a cartel in the real world, cartel again being the term for colluders, right? Most folks have heard the word cartel in the context of drugs. And drug trafficking, and there's the reason that we use that word there, and it's because oftentimes the big players in drug trafficking can sort of work together and kind of own the market, and so they form a cartel in the drug market, right? But the word cartel is not always that negative. It's not always about illegal drugs. It just means that firms or organizations are working together to set prices and quantities in their market. So a well-known and very powerful cartel in the real world is OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So there are 14 member nations that control almost 80% of the world's known oil reserves, and a third of the world's crude production. Saudi Arabia, for example, accounts for about 20% of all of OPEC's reserves and production. So OPEC uses output rationing to maintain prices, right? So with a downward sloping demand curve, if you can reduce output, if you can lower quantities, then what that does is it increases the price that your consumers are willing to pay for your oil. And so OPEC, these 14 countries, get together and they decide we're going to hang on to our oil reserves and only release a certain amount at a time into the market. Therefore, we can maintain higher prices and higher profits for all of us. So they determine the total oil production, and each country within OPEC are assigned a quota. Here's how much oil you're allowed to sell. It's not always effective because some member countries produce over the quota. Why wouldn't they, right? They're still, even though they're working together in this cartel, they're still competing with one another. Each country still would like to make as much profit as possible for itself. And so if you can, everybody else is sticking to the plan and keeping high prices, what if we produce a little bit more and we bring a little more profit to ourselves, right? And so we see wars break out in the Middle East and over oil production, right? The Gulf War, for example, was all about this, all about some countries blaming other countries for cheating in the oil cartel. So OPEC's market power has fallen over time because non-member countries are increasing in production. Particularly the U.S. has increased their oil production using shale technology, fracking, things like that. So OPEC's not quite as powerful as it used to be, but still holds a lot of power in terms of the oil market and determining the prices that we pay for oil and oil products.